A man I've never seen before killed himself in my living room and left a letter addressed to me, animal abuse. It's been about 6 months since I found the body. The homicide case closed. The ruling was a suicide. I had a perfect alibi, backed up by 3 prominent figures, and forensics found no foul play, despite the fact that it was my shotgun, taken, not broken into, from my gun case. No signs of B&E either. I am not supposed to speak about this. I was a prime suspect, and despite the case closure, I still spot tinted vehicles near my residence from time to time. My family knows the brief details of the incident, but I have never spoken to anyone about the letter. It is private, and I am a man who cares greatly for privacy. But I cannot hold this secret within me any longer. It eats away at me, day by day. That is why I have decided to share it with you, anonymously. I have chosen a placeholder name instead of my own, that of brilliant screenwriter Waldo Salt. I should provide some much-needed context. As I usually do on Thursday mornings, I entered my study at approximately 8:17 a.m. to find a man's body slumped across my carpet. For the first few seconds, I genuinely believed it was my friend Stephen, who I had partied with the previous night before crashing asleep as my carpet is crimson and hid the blood well. I was very wrong. To keep things appropriate, as I'd rather not go into visceral detail, there was no possible way to recognize the man. His face, there was nothing left to identify. I've always wondered how I would react upon seeing a corpse. Would I scream, like the final girl of a horror movie? Would I retch? The stench too much to bear. The answer, I found out, is that I am the type of person who simply stands and does not react at all. It took a long time, to perhaps 8:32 a.m., for me to reach for the phone. I followed their instructions to check for breathing, but it wasn't long before an EMT arrived with its sirens off. There were no recent calls for a missing person, husband, or father in the area. The fingerprint analysis came back with a name from 2 states over that I'd never heard of, that I would like to keep anonymous as well. Incarcerated once before, briefly. No family. No friends. There was no funeral for an unrecognizable man, and I wouldn't have attended either way. Now that is the story I told the officers, and the story I have told every person, up until this point. But there is a key detail I have left out. The letter pinned to his chest was addressed to me, and is multiple pages long. Before I continue, I must warn you. This letter is written by an extremely disturbed individual. Within its contents lies confessions to heartless cruelties and depravities. I do not wish for anyone to suffer through this letter as I have done, many times, until the early hours of the morning. But it must be shared. Perhaps one of you may be able to identify him. Perhaps one of you may be able to give advice, as my thoughts run rampant. Or perhaps this is just a story for you, in which case I ask that you please refrain from reading if you feel you have depressive, suicidal, or dependent tendencies. If you choose to share this letter, I don't mind. There is no way to link it back to his suicide or me, and likely no one will believe you. I have other plans for it anyway. Everything he says here is confirmed to be true, in which I mean I have thoroughly traced past records and obituaries, as well as my own house. So please, proceed with caution. Without further ado, below is the letter that was pinned to his shirt collar, transcribed by me. Dear Mr. Salt, how I've wanted to say those words to you, but I believe this may be more fitting. You may not recognize me at first, but you do know me. God, how you know me. I may be getting ahead of myself, however. I ought to tell you my story. But first you must understand one thing. Each word of this carefully crafted, elegant letter to you, yourself, has been pondered, debated, and stitched together in the deepest depths of my darkest self, and as such should not be ignored or read over lightly. Do not breeze through this piece as you would your morning newspaper or your marmalade nutrition facts. Consider each character of every sentence a month of your time, as it very well might have been for me. Please recline in your satin armchair. Light the glowing embers of your fireplace. Make a mug of orange pekoe. I know it is your favorite for nights such as these. I am not asking you to do these things, as so much as I am demanding. You owe me that pleasure, Waldo. in knowing you read this story the way I wanted you to. I've always dreamed of you enjoying something of mine, just like that. You have questions, I know, but for all of this to make sense, we have to start at the beginning. I was raised by blubbering, narcissistic idiots. Uneducated, uncultured, non-sophisticated, most of all neglectful. At the ripe age of 14, I was released into the industrial world with a kick off the doorstep and a few dollars at my feet. A pitiful, sorrowful tale, one a mother would shake her head to and repeat the word tragic as if it were a prayer. I, very much like you, refused to be a tragedy. As quick as I could, I lifted myself from my knees and entered the workforce, skin to my stomach and dirt smeared to my face. I went under a new name, and it wasn't difficult to find a job. They could pay me in pennies and get the same labor of a young man. It wasn't long before I had a steady life at the quarry. After months of back-breaking pickaxe cracks against flint-lined stone, my hunger had diminished, but my face remained filthy. The man laughed every time he gave my bi-weekly pay. We'd line up, all of us in our bumblebee hard helmets, the hulkish men towering over me, and march into the warden's keep. Ahead of me, behind the sweat-soaked backs, I'd hear, "Good job this week. How's the wife and kids?" And I learned to memorize the sound of bank paper sliding into calloused hands. When it was my turn, the desk taller than I was, he'd laugh the same, every time. A gross chortle webbed with phlegm, choking on his fat. He'd dig into his bursting jeans and fish out a handful of coins and pour them into my outstretched ones. Then he'd look me in the eye and say, "Aren't you a bit young to work them shovels?" And laugh again as I left. The same laugh every time. One night, I stayed late after work, hiding behind a large pile of charcoal. He always stayed later, stamping off on ledgers and calling for shipments. I grabbed a brick of cinder, opened the trailer door as quietly as possible, and bashed it into the back of his head so many times that I cut myself on slivers of his skull. Check thumb on right hand for proof of scar. I still remember that immense feeling that washed over me in that moment, staring at his bloated, gurgling mass laying face down on the table. It was when I knew I was destined for something more. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I may be able to add specific contexts and thoughts to segments of the letter, so I will be intruding at various points. The man he speaks of killing, a former employer at a quarry, could not be confirmed. He could have hid the body, although I'm not quite sure how a young teenager would haul this supposedly massive man, but he did work in manual labor. But I believe it is more likely that the man was assumed dead via workplace hazard, as blunt trauma can be quite common at dangerous sites such as those. As you will begin to notice throughout reading this, my letter-bearing corpse is quite intelligent, and even at that age likely framed the employer's death to seem an accident. To scour through the records of all the men who died in any one of the dozens of quarries the name was located near, in an unspecific year, would be quite a task, and an unnecessary one at that. I left the quarry and set off to find work that could challenge me in my intelligence as well as my strength. I would find offers stitched to bulletins and follow the same routine for each job opportunity. In each interview, I would kindly ask to view the layout of the building, whether it be a factory, mill, or warehouse. As the babbling of my maid-bitch tour guide floated past my ears, I'd survey the workers. How greasy was their hair? Were their teeth golden? Did they think, or were their minds made of cinder, just like my old boss came to be? Ever so often I'd stop to look into the eyes of some of them, search for any semblance of humanity. But all I ever found were zombies, trudging along. Lift this, grab that. Lunchtime. It was sickening to imagine, and once I actually vomited all over the interviewer's loafers at the thought of it. Needless to say, I wasn't pleased with any of the future career endeavors that were presented to me. Until I saw a posting for a train conductor. Until I saw you. Salt Railways, one of the largest corporations running coal north of Cheyenne, and the interview went smoothly. Despite my lack of, let's say, passion for other human beings, I know how to talk the talk. I can get in pretty much anywhere. So at first, I played along. I learned the basics. I even helped shovel some of the tender. to the smiles of my soot-faced co-workers. I was quite glad to be your dog. After about 2.5 months, they felt safe around me. Comfortable. That gave me the space I needed. You see, Waldo, I knew I wasn't cut out for being one of your drudgery slaves. Just like you, I wanted to earn my way to the top. So I decided to follow a tutorial, get myself a mentor. And who better to be my mentor than the man I wholeheartedly took that interview for, the man I noticed standing up on that catwalk in a red blazer, silver eyes. You, my love. This is where I became confused, to say the least, with the letter. At first, I had wrote off the beginning as a disgruntled former employee who chose his vengeance to be a death in my living room. But at those words, you, my love, I can't help but feel a sort of thorn wedged somewhere in my abdomen. Is it a thorn of anger for my ruined carpet, or is it a thorn of pity? I haven't quite come to a conclusion. The pinnacle of dreams come true. Untold wealth. But it wasn't the money I yearned for, but what you meant to me, Waldo. Status, power, respect. Maybe love could be achieved after all. So I studied, and I studied hard. I'd work overtime. I'd take holiday shifts. I'd crawl under one of the carriages, shuffle my way into a spot between the dusty rocks and heavy steel, and hide out overnight for work in the morning. In every moment I could seize, even for just a quick glance, I'd study. I'd watch your every movement, how you conducted yourself in front of your inferiors, how you walked with purpose, free, yet vigilant of awkwardness, how you spoke with sincerity, yet humility, which I could tell even just from reading your lips. You wore the same navy tie on Tuesdays, despite all other days of the week having little importance to your uniform. Your Oxfords clicked when you walked, and just from the sound your secretary would prepare herself before you even entered the room. Your hair was clean. Your close-cropped beard wafted cedar. I could tell from here. Perfect high cheekbones. Off-white bone pocket handkerchief. Nothing was ever creased. It wasn't enough. Watching a man of your stature would educate me, surely, but to do so and apply to my own life would require a step further. The first obstacle in my way was the pesky glass separating your office window from the train yard outside, where I spent my days. I needed to get closer to you, so I decided the best course of action would be to disguise myself. At that moment, I was a rat under your feet. If I could pretend, play dress-up for just a little while, just enough to have your eyes trace my body, that would be enough. So I saved up every paycheck I earned for months. I abandoned my prior living situation, that of a regularly rented motel room, and lived under the train cars by night. I hunted raccoons in the nearby woods in the early hours of the morning and ate their carcasses on my lunch break, packed in Tupperwares. I couldn't waste a dime on pleasantries. I lived like the rat I was, unlike my fellow rats playing fairy tale in their man costumes. Soon, I'd have enough money to wear mine, and deserve it. After what felt like lifetimes, weeks blurring into each other, I had enough saved. I went to a tailor, and despite his need to cover his nose with a handkerchief washed in lemon, people do anything for money, I earned myself my first suit. I felt like an imposter at first, wearing it. Had I earned status yet? No. But I soon would. I wrote a new name for myself again, and introduced myself to your secretary as a promising candidate to strike up a deal with Salt. Buying his land, I said. As I entered your office, I felt a bolt of lightning run up my spine, and I suddenly felt extremely anxious. I was not prepared to be in your presence, but it was too late. You opened your door, and for the first time in my life, you spoke to me. I remember your words well, and I will never forget them, not even after death, no matter where I sink into this earth. You spoke with tobacco on your breath. Can I help you? At that moment, I felt such relief. To know what your voice sounded like. I did not answer you. I stood there, finally getting to see your elegant features up close. After about a minute of silence, you coughed and closed your door on me. I forgive your rudeness at that moment, Mr. Salt. I was not worthy of your attention. But after all these years, I finally have an answer for you. Yes, you can help me. I retired from Salt Railways 13 years ago. I do not remember this interaction in the slightest. It disturbs me greatly that a man I had met one time, at some point before I sold the company 13 years ago, remembered that moment to such a fond extent that he would take up so many of his final words to remind me of it. And yet, I still don't have the faintest memory of that day. His idolization is also concerning, but that is something I will touch upon at a later point as we continue this letter. This unrequited ordeal continued for a few years. My longing admiration, staring for hours through your window, and your willful ignorance. It hurt, Waldo, for a long time, but I understood it. I didn't deserve you. Why would you give even a second's thought to someone like me? No, I still hadn't earned you yet. That first meeting was an appetizer, just a small tasting of what I could have. I really can't wait for you to read this. I really can't. How I wish I could have seen your reaction. The way the edges of your lips crease into two small, crooked smiles when something greatly pleases you. How your eyes shine. For those years at the train yard, I would rummage through my brain every day while my sore arms pulled tedious effort after tedious effort. What I would say to you, given another chance. How I wish to dress for you. How I wish to treat you and show you how equal I can be to you. And just as that spark hit my gunpowder, just as I finally figured it out, you left, and I followed. I urge you now, if this letter is beginning to get under your skin, please refrain from reading this next section. It may be incredibly disturbing to some readers. Please continue with caution. I thought I knew you, Waldo. I thought I did. An art dealer? Paintings? What the hell did a railroad company owner know about art? It was a physical shock to my body. I remember being violently ill for about a week's time upon learning the news. How could I allocate myself in your life when you are choosing a new career path I don't know the first thing about? How can I impress you? How can I be yours? So I decided that the best course of action would be to reevaluate. If I couldn't be closer to you in your work life, I had to be closer to you in your personal life. This was a difficult decision, but one that ultimately made sense and was worth it. After all, aren't people meant to share their inner lives with one another? Isn't that art? I'm getting ahead of myself. So I decided to live with you. Now, I knew you didn't know me. Do not take me for a foolish lover. I understand where and when I am wanted. I know that very well. But I knew you, and I'd make you know me, because a man of your stature is one you get attention from by seeking it. The rules of business. So I started by carving a hole into your library wall. Behind the second-to-last bookshelf, the one closest to the southeast corner of the night table with the scarlet lamp, overlooking your satin armchair. This took a long time. About a year of my time. A year without seeing you, sacrificed. I learned your schedule. I picked the lock. It wasn't hard. Trespassing is wrong, I'm well aware. But there are those that kill for love. Sometimes there are tough things you have to do, things that are widely seen as wrong. And I know you know that as well as I do. As they say in art, think outside the box. By the time my home was complete, with eye holes between Sense and Sensibility and the Count of Monte Cristo, it had been a full year. You had changed so much. You were using a different toothpaste brand. You grew out a mustache. Your fingernails were slightly longer. Most importantly, you were an art dealer. I couldn't believe it, but God, how it fit you. You always did have an eye for things most important. I stepped out when you left for work. I made myself cheese sandwiches. I used your pristine toilet paper. I sat where you sat. And then I'd slide right back in and watch you read. I always knew you were smart. I never learned how to read, but I began to pick up on connotations, vowels. When you left, I'd pick up where you left off on each book. I slid my fingers delicately over every spine. I learned to read from watching your eyes, from the small shifts in your lips, silently spelling out every syllable. Yet, I still had so much to learn. Last week, I gathered every book in my library and made a pile out near the desert. I hauled it all over in my friend's pickup truck. Then I burnt every last page. Although, I wish I had kept some of them now. In those first weeks after receiving the letter, I acted rashly at first. angry at this man. Now, I suppose a part of me would have liked to touch the same pages he had. You had a rough go of it when your first painting got rejected. I was just as upset as you were, if not more. There may still be small stain marks on the drywall from how much I cried in silence through my eye holes. I understood you. Your failures were mine. Your rejections, your failed relationships, your lost custody. Your problems were and are unique, and uniquely unknown. Not to me. I hope that brings you a sense of comfort and companionship to hear, but it sparked another fuse within me. That fuse lit a fire when you adopted Maggie. Maggie was my old English Mastiff. She was loving, even for a Mastiff, and would constantly require affection. Despite my initial love and companionship of the dog, it grew to annoy me. And once she was old and ill, she disappeared one afternoon, and I didn't make much of a funeral about it. She lived by my side for roughly a decade. Please keep this in mind when reading the next portion of the letter. I'll admit it, I was envious. It angered me greatly that I could not even touch you. A warm hug, an embrace, a delicate knowing finger upon your cheek. I was satisfied in my home, but I had not achieved my dreams. You had more love and appreciation for a mutt than me. I thought I was your dog, but perhaps I was just your rat. During the days when you left, I'd speak to Maggie. I'm not a loon. I know dogs cannot speak, but she certainly understood me. And she certainly understood how much power she had over me. I fed her well, kept her nice and plump while you were away. Some days I became so frustrated at her that I'd kick her until she whimpered. After about 8 years of coexisting with that disgusting beast dividing your attention, the fire inside me grew to an explosion. I always thought about it, considered every possible way it could work. I even learned her behaviors, but I never believed I'd actually go through with it. Then, one early morning, when you left to work, Maggie began to play with her toy that you had bought her. It cost $28. I lured her out to the backyard and skinned her with a small sickle. I used your workshop in the basement, and I pieced it all together as quickly as I possibly could. I wore it around the house every afternoon you weren't home. It was shoddy, but it was mine, and it was me. It all made sense. That old suit I wore on our first meeting, it didn't feel right. Didn't fit right. I hadn't earned it because I never would. I can't be your equal, Waldo. I've always been your dog. When you came home that night, you didn't notice a thing. I knew you loved me that night when you didn't mourn Maggie. I'll be your Maggie now. This next portion is the final piece of the letter, which takes up the last page of the small stack that was pinned to his corpse, stapled to his bare chest, and only half a page. I surmise that he had planned to write more, but decided he had written enough. If you have read this far, thank you. I'm not alone in this anymore. It's been a long life, Waldo. I'm going to miss you. Despite our fights, our arguments, and small grievances, I believe we really did have something. And so I leave to you a flower. I know it isn't much, but it is all for you. I think it'll look really beautiful, Waldo. You won't ever have to see my mutt face again. All you'll be left with is a beautiful flower. I've thought about it lots, how to leave you with art. As I said before, sharing my inner self with you is the truest form of art. I think your shotgun should be perfect, right underneath my chin, my muzzle. Take in the flower, my inner self on the outside. Take in the petals, the wings of myself, reaching out towards the sun, you. Take in the pollen of my rising fumes, split open like a pumpkin. Take it all in, and call me Maggie. For your consideration, Mr. Salt. As I said before, there was no face left to identify on the body. But he was right. He really did make it look like a flower, blooming from the skull of a dog. Rereading this letter now, it irks me that I cannot find the words to describe my feelings about the man. There is a concoction of loathing and admiration bubbling in me. I wish I could have spoken to him, truly spoken to him. One thing's for certain. He was a true artist. I can't help but recognize such a powerful gesture. A life's man, blooming on my carpet. My thoughts are running rampant. I've been pondering two things every night as I sit on that same armchair he requested me to. Two things I believed I should say when I eventually tell the story of this man to the public. 1. A warning. Listen to me, reader. The next time you enter your house, apartment, bedroom, and something feels slightly off, something just barely out of place of where you last left it, perhaps not even by a noticeable difference, and you believe there is no way it could have been moved, there is no way it could have been touched, doubt yourself. It was. Your gut does not lie. 2. I have considered, and I've made a decision. I would like to recognize this man's piece as a physical work of art, a sculpture, so to speak, and have spoken to the police. They have done nothing with the cadaver, pending investigation, and the local morgue has oddly kept it refrigerated. I have been told that this is a normal procedure, but I can't help but feel as if it is another sign that what I am doing is the correct course of action. I went in yesterday and studied and measured. The flower truly is stunning. I can't wait for you all to see it. I have struck a deal with the Nicolaisen Art Museum in Casper. The body will be displayed there in its entirety. It will be available upon request to observe, along with the letter, and kept refrigerated to allow for a slow decomposition. It will only be available to see for a number of weeks before it fully decomposes, so please visit the flower while you can. I'm glad I got to meet this man, at least once, in that office. There is a small part of me that yearns for that companionship of his eyes behind my bookcase. I ever so often take a glance towards it, but the eye holes remain empty. I suppose I am a lonely man without you. I hope this will suffice enough, Maggie.